The thermometer on the kitchen wall read 72 degrees. Outside, the January wind cut across the Illinois prairie at 30 miles per hour, driving the temperature to 14 below zero. The Weather Service had issued warnings. Schools closed across Tazewell County. Pipes burst in houses throughout Armington. The local power company reported heating systems running at maximum capacity, furnaces burning through fuel that would show up on bills measured in hundreds of dollars. Inside the Davis home, Margaret stood at the stove cooking breakfast for 9 children. No furnace ran, no heating system hummed. The only source of warmth was a small wood stove in the corner, fed by scraps Andy had cut with a chainsaw the week before. The total cost of fuel for the entire winter would come to $1.29. 3 feet above Margaret's head, snow accumulated on the grass that grew on her roof. The family lived under a hill, in a home that local residents had dismissed as impossible, impractical, and insane. They had called Andy Davis a modern-day caveman. They had predicted flooding, collapse, misery. They had said his children would grow up in a damp, dark hole. But that morning, as temperatures plunged to readings that would freeze exposed skin in minutes, the Davis children walked barefoot across carpeted floors, while their neighbors shivered and watched their utility meters spin. The thermometer held steady, 72 degrees. The neighbors had stopped laughing, but 5 years earlier, Andy Davis had been the one paying the bills that made him want to scream. 1971. Andy Davis was an electrician in central Illinois, wiring houses for other people while struggling to heat the one his family rented. He had 9 children. 9. The oldest were teenagers, the youngest still in diapers, and all of them needed to be warm, fed, and sheltered in a part of the country where winter meant business. The house they rented was nothing special. Wood frame construction, single-pane windows, the kind of place that leaked heat like a sieve. Every November, Andy watched the thermostat and the checkbook with equal dread. The furnace kicked on, the meter spun, the bills arrived, $400 a month. That was what it cost to keep his family from freezing through an Illinois winter. $400 in 1971 money, when the median household income was barely $10,000 a year. Andy did the math in his head every time he wrote the check. Nearly $5,000 a year, just to maintain a temperature that felt barely adequate. Money that could have gone toward food, toward clothes for children who outgrew everything, toward someday maybe owning a place of their own. Then came the bill that broke him, January 1972. The winter had been mild, temperatures stayed above normal. Andy had allowed himself a small hope that this month, at least, the damage would be lighter. The bill arrived, $167, for a mild month. Andy sat down in his chair in the living room. He did not speak. He did not move. He held the bill in his hand and stared at the wall, and something inside him shifted from frustration to calculation. Margaret watched him from the kitchen. At first she thought he was tired, then she thought he might be coming down with something. "Andy?" she asked. He did not answer. For 3 weeks, Andy Davis sat in that chair every evening, silent, staring at nothing his family could see. Margaret grew worried enough to consider calling a doctor. The children learned to move quietly around him, sensing that something was happening inside their father's head that could not be interrupted. What was happening was arithmetic. Andy had spent his life wiring other people's houses. He understood heat loss. He understood insulation. He understood that every BTU that escaped through a wall or a window was a BTU you had to pay for twice, once to generate it, once to replace it. Conventional houses were thermal disasters, and everyone just accepted it because that was how houses had always been built. But what if a house didn't have walls exposed to winter wind? Andy thought about basements. Everyone in tornado country knew that basements stayed cool in summer, warm in winter. 55, 60 degrees year-round, regardless of what the air above was doing. The Earth itself was a massive insulator, a thermal battery that absorbed summer heat and released it slowly through winter. At 8 feet below grade, the soil temperature in central Illinois held nearly constant at 58 degrees. 58 degrees, not comfortable on its own. But a 58 degrees starting point was a different problem than a 14 below zero starting point. To reach 70 degrees inside a conventional house during a cold snap, you needed to generate an 84-degree temperature difference. To reach 70 degrees in a space that started at 58, you needed only 12 degrees. 12 degrees. That was a wood stove. That was body heat from 11 people and whatever they were cooking. That was nothing. After 3 weeks, Andy spoke. "I'm going to build us a house," he told Margaret. "Underground." Margaret had learned long ago that when Andy made up his mind, the discussion was about practical details, not whether the thing would happen. She asked what she always asked. How much? Andy had done the math. Concrete was cheap. Labour was free if you did it yourself. Land in rural Tazewell County cost almost nothing. $15,000, he said, total. Margaret looked at him. $15,000 was less than they would spend on heating bills in 4 years if they stayed where they were. It was less than the price of a modest conventional house, which would still cost $400 a month to heat. "Where?" she asked. "Armington. There's a hill." What Andy did not tell her, what he did not tell anyone, was that he had no formal training in construction, no engineering degree, no architecture background. He was an electrician who understood wiring and had watched other people build houses. He had never designed a structure in his life. He had certainly never designed one that would bear the weight of 3 feet of soil on its roof while keeping water out of the living space below. He was going to figure it out as he went. The first person he told outside his family was his neighbour, a man who had farmed the area for 30 years and had seen plenty of schemes come and go. The neighbour listened to Andy's plan. He listened to the part about digging into the hillside. He listened to the part about pouring concrete and covering it with earth. He listened to the part about the wood stove and the 12-degree differential. When Andy finished, the neighbour shook his head. "Andy," he said, "that ground holds water. You dig a hole and put your family in it, you're going to be swimming by spring. That's not a house, that's a cistern." Andy had considered the water problem. He had a plan involving drainage tile, bentonite clay, and the slope of the hill. He tried to explain it. The neighbour cut him off. "I've lived here 30 years. I know what happens when you dig holes in this ground. You're going to flood out, and then what? You'll have spent $15,000 on a swimming pool with a roof." Andy thanked him for his concern and went to apply for a building permit. The Tazewell County Building Department had never seen anything like the plans Andy Davis brought them. Technically, they were not plans. They were sketches, hand-drawn diagrams showing a circular structure built into a hillside covered with earth, accessible through a single entrance that emerged at ground level. The drawings showed no conventional framing, no standard roofing materials, no familiar elements that the inspectors could evaluate against existing code. The inspector assigned to the Davis case was a methodical man who had spent his career ensuring that buildings in Tazewell County met the standards that kept people safe. He studied Andy's sketches for a long time. "Mr. Davis," he said finally, "I don't know how to evaluate this. There's no code for underground houses. There's no standard I can check this against. I'm not saying you can't build it. I'm saying I don't know if it's safe, and neither do you." Andy asked what it would take to get approval. "An engineer's stamp," the inspector said. "Someone with credentials who'll put their name on it and say this won't collapse on your family. You get me that? I'll issue the permit. Without it?" He shook his head. "I can't approve something I don't understand." Andy did not have money for an engineer. The $15,000 budget was already tight, and professional engineering certification could cost thousands more. He left the building department with the sketches rolled under his arm and a choice to make: abandon the project, find money he didn't have, or build without a permit and hope no one noticed. He found a third option. A structural engineer at a nearby university agreed to review Andy's design for a reduced fee, partly out of professional curiosity. The engineer was skeptical. The circular shape was unusual, the load calculations were unconventional, but the math checked out. Concrete, properly reinforced and properly formed, could bear the weight Andy was proposing. The circular design actually distributed pressure more efficiently than rectangular construction. The engineer signed off. The permit came through. Now Andy just had to build it. Word spread through Armington faster than Andy could dig. The electrician was building a cave. The man with 9 children was going to put his family in a hole in the ground. Had anyone seen the plans? Did anyone know what he was thinking? The reactions broke along predictable lines. Some people were curious, a few were quietly supportive, the type who appreciated anyone willing to try something different. But most of the community fell somewhere between skepticism and open mockery. The comments filtered back to Andy through his children, through Margaret, through the thin social membrane of a small town where everyone knew everyone's business. Some folks scoffed at his idea, a local journalist would later write. They began calling the Davises modern-day Flintstones, the cartoon caveman family. The joke that reduced Andy's careful calculations to a primitive regression, a step backward in human progress. The nickname stuck. When Andy's children went to school, other kids asked if they were going to live in bedrock. When Margaret went to the grocery store, she heard whispers in the checkout line. The loudest skeptic was a contractor who had built conventional houses in the area for 2 decades. He found Andy at the hardware store one afternoon, loading supplies into his truck. "Davis," the contractor said, "I've been building houses around here since before you started wiring them. You know what happens to underground structures? They leak. Every basement I've ever seen takes on water eventually. You're not building a basement, you're building a house that's all basement. You're going to have water coming through those walls, and your family is going to be living in a mushroom farm." Andy set down the bag of concrete he was carrying. "I've got drainage planned. Tile around the perimeter, bentonite on the exterior. The water will flow away from the structure, not into it." The contractor laughed. "Bentonite? That's the clay they use in ponds to hold water in. You're going to use it to keep water out. Do you hear yourself?" Andy tried to explain the principle. Bentonite swelled when wet, creating a seal that water couldn't penetrate, but the contractor was already walking away, shaking his head. "When your wife is mopping the floor every day and your kids are sleeping in damp beds, you'll remember I told you," the contractor called over his shoulder. "That's not a house. That's a grave you can walk into." The words hung in the air. A grave you can walk into. Andy loaded the rest of his supplies and drove home. Margaret had learned to read her husband's moods over 20 years of marriage. That evening she saw the tension in his shoulders as he unloaded the truck. "What happened?" she asked. Andy told her about the contractor. He repeated the line about the grave. He waited for her reaction. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you believe him?" Andy shook his head. "He doesn't understand what I'm doing. He's thinking about basements. I'm thinking about something different." "Then it doesn't matter what he believes." But it did matter. Not because Andy doubted his calculations, but because doubt was a living thing that grew when fed. The contractor's words joined the neighbours' warnings, joined the building inspector's confusion, joined every sideways glance in town. Each voice alone was easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a chorus that followed Andy to the job site every morning and whispered in his ear every night. What if they're right? Andy did not share these thoughts with Margaret. He did not share them with anyone. He pushed them down and focused on the concrete. Spring 1976. The excavation began. Andy rented a backhoe and attacked the hillside outside Armington. The soil came up in great red-brown chunks, exposing the clay substrate that would either doom his project or save it. He dug for days, carving out a space roughly 30 feet in diameter and 8 feet deep, following the contour of the hill so that the entrance would emerge at natural ground level on the low side. The work was brutal. April in Illinois meant mud season, and the excavation site became a slippery mess that threatened to collapse every time it rained. Andy reinforced the cuts with temporary shoring, racing against the weather. His children helped when they could, the older ones hauling debris, the younger ones staying clear of the heavy equipment. By May, the hole was ready for concrete. The forming took 3 weeks. Andy built the framework for a circular structure with walls 8 inches thick, reinforced with rebar at 12-inch intervals. The roof would be a concrete dome, slightly arched to distribute the eventual weight of the soil above. He calculated the load again and again. 3 feet of earth, saturated with water after heavy rain, pressing down with tremendous force. The concrete had to hold. If it cracked, water would find the crack. If water found the crack, the structure would fail. The pour happened on a Saturday in June. Andy hired a concrete truck and a small crew to help. Neighbours who had offered to work for the cost of dinner, and the satisfaction of seeing something unusual take shape. The concrete flowed into the forms in a continuous grey stream, filling the walls and the dome in a single marathon session that lasted 14 hours. When it was done, Andy stood in the center of what would become his living room and looked up at the raw concrete ceiling. Outside, the sun was setting. Inside, it was already cool. The earth was doing its work, pulling heat out of the summer air and storing it for later. But the real test was months away. First, there was waterproofing to apply, then 3 feet of soil to move. Then the finish work, plumbing, electrical, the interior walls and floors that would make this cavern into a home. And then winter. The contractor's words echoed in Andy's mind. A grave you can walk into. Andy brushed concrete dust from his hands and went home to sleep. The waterproofing took longer than Andy expected. He had designed a 3-layer system, a coating of bentonite clay applied directly to the exterior concrete, followed by drainage tile laid at the footer level, followed by a layer of gravel to direct water away from the structure and toward the tile. The theory was simple. Water would hit the bentonite, be unable to penetrate, and flow downward to the drainage system, which would carry it away before it could accumulate. The execution was tedious. Andy mixed the bentonite by hand, creating a slurry that he troweled onto every square inch of exterior surface. The clay was messy, unpredictable, and slow to apply. His fingers cracked from the constant contact with the alkaline mixture. His back ached from hours bent over in the narrow space between the concrete wall and the excavation edge. Margaret brought him lunch at the site one afternoon and found him covered in grey-brown clay, looking like something that had crawled out of the primordial mud. "Is it working?" she asked. Andy wiped his face, smearing more clay across his cheek. "I won't know until it rains." "When will that be?" Andy looked at the sky. Clear blue, not a cloud in sight. "Soon, I hope. I need to see it work before I bury it." The rain came 2 weeks later. A heavy June thunderstorm that dropped 3 inches in 4 hours, turning the excavation site into a temporary pond. Andy drove out in the middle of the downpour and climbed down into the pit, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. The walls were dry. Water pooled at the footer level, exactly as designed, and flowed toward the drainage tile. The bentonite had swelled, sealing the concrete surface. Not a drop had penetrated. Andy allowed himself a single moment of relief. Then he climbed out of the pit and went to find more gravel. The waterproofing had passed its first test, but the real exam was still coming. A summer storm was one thing. A winter of freeze-thaw cycles, when ice would expand in every tiny crack, was something else entirely. He still had 3 feet of soil to move. July, August. The backfill began. Andy hired a truck to deliver topsoil and supervise the burial of his own home. Load after load dumped onto the concrete dome, spreading in waves that slowly transformed the structure from an obvious man-made form into a gentle hill. By early September, the only visible evidence of the house was the entrance tunnel emerging from the slope and the ventilation pipes that rose like periscopes from the grass. Inside, the temperature had already stabilized. Andy checked the thermometer daily. 62 degrees in August when conventional houses baked in the summer heat. 60 degrees in September as the nights grew cooler. The earth was storing the summer's warmth, preparing to release it through the coming winter, but the interior was still raw concrete and exposed wiring. Andy had 6 weeks until winter to make the space livable. 6 weeks to install plumbing, hang drywall, lay carpet, finish the kitchen and bathroom, and move his family out of the rental they could no longer afford. He worked 18-hour days. The children helped after school. Margaret handled the finish details, paint colours, curtain fabric, the small touches that would make a concrete cylinder feel like home. They ate dinners in the half-finished space, surrounded by sawdust and the smell of fresh paint. October brought the first frost. The rental lease was up. Ready or not, the Davis family was moving underground. The morning of the move, Andy stood outside the entrance and looked at the hill that contained his entire future. Inside, Margaret was directing children to their new bedrooms. Outside, the grass on the roof rippled in the autumn wind. A car slowed on the county road. The driver, Andy recognized him as an acquaintance from town, rolled down his window. "Davis," the man called. "You really did it, huh? You really moved your family into that thing?" Andy nodded. The man shook his head, smiling the way people smile when they're watching someone make a mistake they'll regret. "Well, good luck to you. You're going to need it." The car pulled away. Andy went inside. The thermometer on the wall read 61 degrees. Outside it was 43 and dropping. Winter was 6 weeks away. November in central Illinois was rehearsal for the main event. Temperatures dropped into the 30s, occasionally the 20s. Light snow fell and melted. The fields turned brown and dormant, waiting for the deep freeze that everyone knew was coming. Inside the Davis Cave home, the temperature stayed between 60 and 64 degrees without any supplemental heat. Andy watched the thermometer like other men watch stock tickers. Every degree was data. Every stable reading was evidence that his calculations were correct. Margaret noticed that he checked the thermometer first thing every morning, before coffee, before anything else. "What number are you looking for?" she asked. "Anything above 58, Andy said. "That's the ground temperature at this depth. If we're staying above that, it means the house is holding its heat. If we drop below that, it means we're losing to the earth and we've got a problem." They never dropped below 58. As November turned to December, the interior temperature held between 60 and 64 degrees, fluctuating slightly with the number of people in the house and what Margaret was cooking. 60 degrees was cool but manageable. The children wore sweaters. The family gathered in the main living area, where body heat accumulated. Andy fired up the wood stove once on a particularly cold evening, and the temperature jumped to 70 within an hour. This is going to work, Andy thought. But the real winter hadn't arrived. The polar air mass that swept down from Canada every January, the deep freeze that killed car batteries and burst pipes and sent heating bills into the stratosphere, that was still coming. The first week of January, the temperature dropped to 14 below zero. Andy woke that morning and checked the thermometer before his feet hit the floor. 71 degrees. The wood stove had burned overnight, fed by scraps he'd cut with a chainsaw. Total fuel consumption, a few armloads of wood that would cost him, in chainsaw gas and bar oil, about $1.29 for the entire winter. Outside, the wind chill made exposed skin dangerous within minutes. Schools closed. The county issued travel warnings. Andy's neighbours huddled around furnaces that ran continuously, burning fuel at rates that would produce bills measured in hundreds of dollars. Inside the Davis home, Margaret cooked breakfast. The children argued over bathroom time. The thermometer held steady, 71 degrees. The neighbours had called him crazy. They had called his home a grave. They had said his children would live in a mushroom farm, sleeping in damp beds, breathing mould. Instead, his children walked barefoot across carpeted floors while the rest of Tazewell County froze. But the winter wasn't over, and the greatest test, the one Andy hadn't predicted, the one nobody could have planned for, was still 3 weeks away. The storm arrived on January 26, 1977. Weather forecasters had tracked it for days, a massive low-pressure system sweeping across the Great Plains, pulling Arctic air down from Canada and colliding with moisture from the Gulf. The National Weather Service upgraded their warnings every few hours. Blizzard conditions expected, travel impossible, wind chills fatal. Andy watched the news that evening while Margaret put the younger children to bed. The television showed satellite images, maps with swirling arrows, meteorologists pointing at fronts that looked like battle lines. Central Illinois sat directly in the path. "How bad?" Margaret asked. "Bad," Andy said. "They're saying 2 feet of snow, maybe more. Winds up to 50 miles per hour. Temperature dropping to 30 below." Margaret glanced at the thermometer on the kitchen wall. 68 degrees. "Should we do anything? Stock up on wood?" Andy considered. They had plenty of wood cut and stacked in the entrance tunnel, enough for 2 weeks of continuous burning if needed. The house was designed to maintain temperature through passive means, but extreme conditions called for backup. "I'll bring more inside," he said, "just in case." That night, Andy lay awake listening to the wind begin to build outside. The sound was strange from underground, a distant roar, muffled by 3 feet of soil, more felt than heard. In a conventional house, the wind would have been rattling windows, whistling through cracks, sucking heat from every surface. Here, it was a rumour. By morning, the blizzard had arrived. The first 12 hours were merely severe. Snow fell in horizontal sheets, driven by winds that gusted to 45 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to 0. The county road outside the Davis property disappeared under drifts that accumulated faster than any plough could clear. Inside, the temperature dropped 2 degrees, from 68 to 66. Andy fed the wood stove and monitored the thermometer hourly. Margaret kept the children occupied with games and books, treating the storm as an adventure rather than an emergency. By mid-afternoon, the power went out. Andy noticed the lights flicker first, then die completely. The silence that followed was total. No hum from the refrigerator, no buzz from the fluorescent fixtures, no background noise of any kind except the muffled wind. In a conventional house, the power failure would have been the beginning of a crisis. Furnaces required electricity to run. Without power, there was no heat. Without heat, pipes would freeze within hours. Families across Tazewell County were already making desperate plans, bundling up, running generators, packing into cars to flee to shelters that still had power. The Davis family lit candles. "Should we be worried?" one of the older children asked. Andy shook his head. "We don't need the power for heat. The house stays warm by itself. The stove is just extra." He said it with confidence, but he checked the thermometer again anyway, 65 degrees. The temperature was slowly dropping, but the rate was glacial, a degree or two per hour at most. At this pace, even if the stove went out completely, the house would stay above 55 for days. But the storm was getting worse. By midnight, the wind had reached sustained speeds of 50 miles per hour, with gusts hitting 65. The temperature outside plummeted to 32 below zero. The wind chill, the combined effect of cold and wind on exposed flesh, hit 70 below zero. At that temperature, frostbite begins in under 5 minutes. Exposed skin can freeze solid in 10. Andy ventured out once, around 2 in the morning, to check that the ventilation pipes hadn't become blocked by drifting snow. He dressed in every layer he owned: long underwear, flannel, insulated coveralls, 2 pairs of gloves, a face mask, and pushed open the entrance door against a drift that had accumulated to knee height. The cold hit him like a physical force. He felt his eyes water immediately, the tears threatening to freeze on his cheeks. The wind roared past at a volume that made thought difficult. He could see nothing, just white, churning, horizontal. He struggled through the drift to the ventilation pipes, cleared the snow from their caps, and retreated back inside. The entire expedition took less than 10 minutes. When he pulled off his gloves, his fingers were numb. Margaret was waiting with coffee. "How is it?" Andy shook his head. "I've never felt anything like it. If someone's out there, if anyone got stuck or lost." He didn't finish the sentence. They sat together at the kitchen table, listening to the storm rage above them. The walls of their home were invisible, buried, immune. The thermometer read 63 degrees, outside 32 below, inside 63 above, a 95-degree differential, and the house was holding. The storm continued for 36 hours. By the time the wind finally died and the snow stopped falling, central Illinois had received 28 inches of accumulation on top of drifts that reached 8 feet in some areas. The county declared a state of emergency. The National Guard was deployed to rescue stranded motorists and check on rural residents who had been unreachable since the power failed. The power stayed out for 3 days. 3 days without electricity, in temperatures that dropped to 30 below, with wind chills that touched 80 below during the worst gusts. 3 days that killed at least 20 people across the Midwest, most of them elderly or stranded, victims of hypothermia and frozen pipes and furnaces that couldn't run. In the Davis Cave home, the lowest the temperature ever dropped was 61 degrees. 61 degrees, without power, without the furnace that the house didn't have, without anything except 3 feet of soil, concrete walls, and a small wood stove that Andy fed twice a day with scraps that would have cost pennies if he'd bought them. When the power finally returned and the roads were cleared, the first visitor to the Davis property was a reporter from the regional newspaper. He had heard rumors: the electrician in Armington, the cave house, the family that rode out the storm without power and without discomfort. He wanted to see for himself. Andy led him inside. The reporter looked at the thermometer, 70 degrees now that the stove was back to normal operation, and then looked at Andy. "How is this possible?" the reporter asked. Andy explained the physics, the soil temperature, the thermal mass. the 12-degree differential instead of the 90-degree differential. The reporter wrote everything down. Then he asked the question that Andy had been waiting for someone to ask. What did it cost to heat this house through the blizzard? Andy did the math out loud. Chainsaw gas, bar oil, the wood itself was free, culled from his own property. $1.29, Andy said, for the whole winter. The reporter stared at him. The whole winter? Not just the blizzard? The whole winter. That's all I've spent on heat since November. The reporter wrote that down too. Then he went home and wrote a story that would change Andy Davis's life. Illinois man heats home for $1.29. The headline ran in the regional paper first, then got picked up by the Associated Press. Within weeks, Andy Davis was a national story. Money magazine put him on the cover. People magazine sent a photographer. Network news crews drove out from Chicago and St. Louis, hauling cameras and lights into the cave home that had become a symbol of something larger than one family's survival. The coverage arrived at a perfect moment. The energy crisis of the early 1970s had left Americans traumatized by oil embargoes and gas lines. The winter of '77 had killed people and bankrupted families with heating bills that seemed designed to punish anyone who needed to stay warm. And here was an electrician from rural Illinois who had solved the problem with concrete, dirt, and common sense. The phone started ringing. At first, the calls were from journalists, then from curious homeowners, then from builders and contractors who had initially dismissed Andy as a crank, but now wanted to understand how his system worked. The same people who had called him a caveman were asking for tours, for blueprints, for the secret to escaping utility bills forever. Andy gave the tours. He answered the questions. He showed visitors the drainage system that kept the walls dry, the thermal mass that kept the temperature stable, the wood stove that barely needed to run, but one visitor mattered more than the rest. The contractor who had predicted flooding came by in early March, when the snow was melting and water was everywhere in central Illinois. He parked his truck at the entrance to Andy's property and walked down the hill to the front door, his boots squelching in the mud. Andy saw him coming and went outside to meet him. For a moment, neither man spoke. The contractor looked at the grass growing on the roof, the ventilation pipes rising from the soil, the ordinary entrance door that led into a home built like no other in the county. "Davis," the contractor finally said, "I came to see it." "You want a tour?" The contractor nodded. Andy led him inside. They walked through the living room, the kitchen, the bedrooms where the 9 Davis children slept on dry carpeting. The contractor touched the walls, looking for moisture. He checked the corners where water would collect if the drainage had failed. He examined the ceiling, the floors, the window wells that brought natural light into the underground space. Everything was dry. Everything was warm. The thermometer read 69 degrees on a day when the outside temperature was 43. When the tour was over, the contractor stood in the entrance tunnel, coat in hand, struggling with something. "I told you it was going to flood," he said. Andy waited. "I told you your kids were going to sleep in damp beds. I told you this was a grave you could walk into." "I remember." The contractor took a breath. "I was wrong. I was completely wrong. I've been building houses for 20 years and I've never seen anything like what you've done here. This place is dry, it's warm, and you spent nothing to heat it through the worst winter I've ever seen." He extended his hand. Andy shook it. "I'd like to learn," the contractor said. "I'd like to understand how you did this. I think there might be people who'd want to live this way if they knew it was possible." Andy smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "Come back next week. I'll show you the drawings." But not everyone converted. The building inspector, who had initially demanded an engineer's stamp, remained cautious, even after the blizzard coverage. When Andy inquired about making his design available to others, the inspector warned that each new structure would require individual certification. There was still no building code for underground homes. There was still no standard to check against. "What you built works for you," the inspector said, "but I can't tell someone else to build the same thing and promise it'll work for them. Every site is different. Every soil condition is different. Without a code, I can't approve anything based on your experience alone." Andy understood the inspector's position. The man wasn't being difficult, he was being careful. Building codes existed because buildings sometimes failed, and when buildings failed, people got hurt or killed. The inspector's job was to prevent that, and Andy's one successful example wasn't enough to create a standard. So Andy started documenting. He recorded temperatures daily, creating logs that showed the interior climate through every season. He photographed the drainage system during heavy rains, proving that water flowed away from the structure as designed. He measured humidity levels, checking for the dampness that critics had predicted. He collected utility bills, the tiny amounts he spent on chainsaw fuel, the zero he spent on furnace operation, and compiled them into records that any inspector could verify. By 1978, he had a portfolio. By 1979, he had a reputation. And by 1980, his son Marty had decided to turn the cave home concept into a business. Marty Davis was in his early 20s when he built his first earth-sheltered home for a paying client. He had grown up in the cave house, understood its principles intimately, and had watched his father field thousands of inquiries from people who wanted something similar. The first Davis Caves project went up in Logan County, Illinois, for a family named Northrop. Marty supervised every phase: excavation, forming, pouring, waterproofing, backfill. He refined his father's techniques, standardizing the bentonite application, improving the drainage tile layout, developing a warranty against leakage that no conventional builder would dare offer. The Northrops moved in during the winter of '78. The house performed exactly as promised. When the family left for a 3-day weekend during one of the coldest stretches on record, temperatures dropping to 15 below, they returned to find the interior at 62 degrees. No heat had been running, no pipes had frozen, the thermal mass had held. The Northrops told their friends told their friends. By the early 1980s, Marty Davis was building earth-sheltered homes across Illinois and into neighboring states. The numbers accumulated: 50 homes, 100 homes, each one documented, each one monitored, each one proving that the basic principle worked: bury your house and the earth keeps you comfortable. 200 homes, 303. By the time Marty Davis had completed his 300th cave home, reaching as far as Denmark, the skeptics had largely fallen silent. The evidence was overwhelming. Not one home, but hundreds. Not one winter, but decades. Not one family's experience, but a database of temperature logs, utility bills, and satisfied homeowners who had escaped the tyranny of heating and cooling costs forever. The model home that Marty built for himself in Logan County needed neither furnace nor air conditioner. The interior temperature varied by less than 10 degrees across an entire year, regardless of whether the outside was 15 below zero in January or 95 degrees in August. Andy Davis died on August 5, 1995, at age 66. He died in the cave home he had built 19 years earlier, the home that everyone said would flood and collapse and become a grave. He died in a house that had never leaked, never failed, never cost more than pocket change to operate. His final resting place was not the cave home itself. But in a sense, it was his monument, a proof that the neighbors had been wrong, the contractors had been wrong, the entire building industry had been wrong about what a house needed to be. The legacy of Andy Davis extends far beyond Tazewell County. Earth-sheltered construction, once dismissed as a fringe curiosity, is now recognized by the U.S. Department of Energy as a legitimate approach to energy-efficient housing. Government studies confirm that underground homes can reduce heating and cooling costs by 50 to 80%. Research from the University of Minnesota found that earth-sheltered homes had resale values 30 to 40% higher than conventional construction. The physics haven't changed since Andy sat in his chair in 1972, doing the math that would transform his family's life. At 8 feet below grade, soil temperature holds constant. A 12-degree boost is easier than an 80-degree boost. Concrete and dirt last longer than wood and shingles. Water flows downhill if you let it. What changed was the evidence. Davis Cave's homes have survived tornadoes that destroyed every structure around them. They have maintained comfortable temperatures during heat waves that killed people in conventional houses. They have shrugged off blizzards that knocked out power for days and sent utility bills into the thousands. Roger and Pat Wehage, who built a Davis Caves home in Chillicothe, Illinois, reported that they could leave their house for an entire winter with no heat at all, and the temperature would never drop below 60 degrees. When other homeowners worried about freezing pipes during cold snaps, the Wehages worried about nothing. In the United Kingdom, the Honingham Earth-Sheltered Social Housing Project, the country's first underground social housing development, achieved results that stunned even the assessors. Residents reported keeping their homes at 72 degrees without any heating during winter. Running costs came to less than £4 per week. The project's energy rating exceeded the maximum score that assessors had believed possible. The houses kept being built. The evidence kept accumulating. The skeptics kept falling silent. But the most visceral validation came not from temperature logs or utility bills. It came from the weather that central Illinois knew all too well. Tornado Alley runs through the heart of the Midwest, a corridor where warm Gulf air collides with cold Canadian fronts and spawns some of the most violent storms on Earth. Every spring, sirens wail across Illinois, and families sprint for storm cellars, basements, any underground refuge that might protect them from winds that can exceed 200 miles per hour. Andy Davis understood this. He had lived in Tornado Alley his entire life. He had seen the damage, the destruction, the homes reduced to foundations by a few seconds of rotating wind. In one of his last interviews, Davis delivered the line that became the defining quote of the earth-sheltered housing movement. This part of the country turns into Tornado Alley every spring, and each time one of those twisters comes through, where does everyone head? Underground, to the storm cellar. Well, guess what? I'm already here, and I've got my whole house with me. The storm cellar that was also a house, the refuge that was also a home. The solution that had been obvious for 10,000 years, humans lived in caves before they lived in buildings, rediscovered by an electrician who was tired of paying $400 a month to heat a leaky rental. The neighbors had called him a caveman. They had called him crazy. They had called his home a grave. They were right about one thing. Andy Davis was a caveman. He was just smarter than they realized. January in central Illinois. 40 years after Andy Davis built his cave home, the wind still cuts across the prairie, the temperature still plunges below zero, and families still watch their heating bills climb to numbers that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. But in Armington, in Logan County, in Chillicothe and Denmark and all the other places where earth-sheltered homes have taken root, the story is different. Inside those homes, the thermometers hold steady. The walls stay dry. The utility bills stay small. The families walk barefoot across carpeted floors while their neighbors shiver and pay. 70 degrees year-round. Andy Davis proved it was possible. His son proved it was repeatable. 300 homes and counting proved it was not a fluke. The neighbors stopped laughing a long time ago. Some of them moved underground themselves. And somewhere in Tazewell County, under a gentle hill that looks like any other, the house that everyone said would fail continues to do what it was designed to do, keeping the people inside warm, dry, and protected from a world that demands payment for every degree of comfort. Andy Davis paid $1.29. The earth did the rest.